In the world of military service, respect is earned through sweat, blood, and unwavering dedication. But what happens when prejudice clouds judgment and someone makes the fatal mistake of underestimating a warrior based on appearance alone? Sometimes the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about people we think we know. This is the story of a confrontation that would shake the foundations of military hierarchy and remind everyone that true strength often comes in unexpected packages. It's a tale that proves beyond doubt that you should never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book contains 25 years of the most elite military training known to mankind. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training facility in San Diego, California. The sound of boots hitting pavement echoed through the air as various service members went about their morning routines. Among them walked Sarah Martinez, a woman whose appearance might fool the casual observer. At 5 feet 6 inches tall with an athletic but not overly muscular build, she moved with a quiet confidence that spoke of years of discipline and training. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her uniform was pristine, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. Sarah had arrived at the Joint Training Facility that morning for a special briefing. As a recently retired Navy SEAL with 25 years of active duty behind her, she now served as a civilian consultant, sharing her expertise with various military units. Her career had been nothing short of extraordinary, though she wore her achievements with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout her service. From her early days as one of the first women to successfully complete SEAL training to her numerous classified missions across 3 different theaters of operation, Sarah had proven herself time and again in ways that most people would never know or understand. The facility buzzed with activity as different branches of the military conducted joint exercises. Marines, Navy personnel, Army soldiers, and Air Force members all shared the space, creating a unique environment where different military cultures intersected. It was in this setting that Sarah encountered Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a Marine with 8 years of service under his belt. Rodriguez was everything you might expect from a Marine recruiter poster: tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of swagger that came from years of believing in his own superiority. Rodriguez had been having a particularly frustrating morning. His unit had been assigned to work with naval personnel on a joint operation exercise, and he harbored the typical inter-service rivalry that many Marines felt toward their Navy counterparts. In his mind, Marines were the elite fighting force, the few and the proud, while sailors were just support personnel who happened to wear a similar uniform. This prejudice had been reinforced throughout his career by the echo chamber of like-minded Marines who shared his narrow worldview. As Sarah walked through the common area, checking her watch and reviewing notes for her upcoming briefing, she accidentally bumped into Rodriguez as he rounded a corner. The collision was minor, barely more than a brush of shoulders, but it was enough to knock a folder from his hands, scattering papers across the floor. Any reasonable person would have recognized it as a simple accident, the kind that happens hundreds of times a day in busy facilities like this one. "Watch where you're going," Rodriguez snapped, his voice carrying the authority he was accustomed to wielding over subordinates. He looked down at Sarah, his eyes quickly taking in her naval uniform and what he perceived as her slight stature. In his mind, she immediately fit into a category he had created: weak Navy personnel who didn't belong in the same space as real warriors. Sarah, true to her training and temperament, immediately bent down to help collect the scattered papers. "I apologize, Staff Sergeant," she said calmly, reading his rank from his uniform. "Let me help you with these." Her voice carried no trace of defensiveness or anger, just the professional courtesy that had served her well throughout her career. She had learned long ago that escalating minor conflicts served no purpose and often revealed more about the aggressor than the victim. But Rodriguez was not interested in her help or her apology. Something about her calm demeanor seemed to irritate him further, as if her lack of visible intimidation was somehow an insult to his authority. "I don't need help from some Navy desk jockey," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of several nearby service members. "Why don't you go back to your supply closet or wherever it is you people hide when the real work needs to be done?" The comment stung, not because Sarah doubted her own abilities, but because she had heard variations of it throughout her career. Even after proving herself countless times, even after earning every qualification and commendation available to a SEAL, she still encountered people who saw her gender and made assumptions about her capabilities. She had learned to choose her battles carefully, understanding that sometimes the best response was no response at all. Standing up slowly, she handed him the paper she had collected, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Here are your documents, Staff Sergeant," she said simply. "I hope the rest of your day goes better." She turned to walk away, but Rodriguez wasn't finished. Something about her composure seemed to fuel his aggression rather than defuse it. "That's right, walk away," he called after her, his voice carrying across the common area. "That's what you Navy types do best. Run away when things get tough. Leave the real fighting to the Marines." Several other service members had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, recognizing that Rodriguez was crossing lines of professional conduct, while others seemed curious to see how the situation would develop. Sarah stopped walking, but didn't turn around immediately. She closed her eyes for a moment, drawing on the patience and self-control that had been hammered into her through years of the most demanding training imaginable. When she did turn around, her expression remained neutral, though those who knew her well might have detected the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was reaching the limits of her tolerance. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, reading his name tape, "I understand you're having a difficult morning, but I'd suggest we both return to our duties and put this behind us." Her voice remained steady, professional, giving him every opportunity to back down gracefully. She had no desire to humiliate him or create a scene, but she also wouldn't allow him to continue his verbal assault unchallenged. Rodriguez, however, interpreted her calm response as weakness. In his worldview, anyone who didn't immediately respond to aggression with greater aggression was soft, unworthy of respect. He stepped closer to her, using his height advantage to loom over her in what he clearly intended as an intimidating manner. "Are you trying to tell me what to do, sailor?" he demanded. "Because last time I checked, Marines don't take orders from Navy support staff." The phrase support staff hit particularly hard. Sarah had spent a quarter-century in roles that were anything but support. She had led missions behind enemy lines, trained foreign military units, and participated in operations that remained classified to this day. She had earned medals for valor that Rodriguez would never even qualify to receive. But none of that was visible on her uniform at this moment, and Rodriguez was too blinded by his own prejudices to consider that appearances might be deceiving. "I'm not giving you orders, Staff Sergeant," Sarah replied, her voice still controlled but carrying a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. "I'm offering you professional courtesy and suggesting we both move on with our day. But if you'd prefer to continue this conversation, I'm happy to oblige." Something in her tone should have warned Rodriguez that he was walking into dangerous territory. There was a quality to her voice, a subtle shift that spoke of confidence earned through trials he couldn't imagine. But he was too caught up in his own sense of superiority to recognize the warning signs. Instead, he saw her willingness to continue the confrontation as confirmation that she was trying to challenge his authority. "You know what your problem is?" he said, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "You people think you can just show up here and act like you belong with real warriors. But when push comes to shove, when the bullets start flying, you'll be nowhere to be found. Marines have been carrying the Navy's water for decades, and I'm sick of pretending otherwise." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, with service members from various branches stopping to watch the confrontation unfold. Some pulled out their phones, recognizing that they might be witnessing something worth recording. Others looked around nervously, hoping that a superior officer would intervene before the situation escalated further. But no intervention came, and Rodriguez seemed energized by the attention. Sarah glanced around at the growing crowd, then back at Rodriguez. She had reached a decision point that every warrior faces at some point in their career: when to walk away and when to stand your ground. Everything in her training told her to de-escalate, to be the bigger person, to avoid unnecessary conflict. But there's also a principle at stake here, not just for her, but for every service member who had ever been underestimated or dismissed based on assumptions rather than facts. "Staff Sergeant," she said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command, "you're making some very broad generalizations about people you don't know. I'd strongly recommend reconsidering your approach before this conversation goes somewhere you might regret." But Rodriguez was beyond listening to reason. The crowd, the attention, and his own inflated sense of superiority had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. "Are you threatening me?" he demanded, stepping even closer. "Because if you are, maybe it's time someone taught you Navy types your place." The threat hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored. Sarah looked around at the faces watching them, seeing a mixture of anticipation, concern, and curiosity. She thought about her 25 years of service, about the young service members watching who might draw the wrong conclusions if she simply walked away from this bully. She thought about every person who had ever been dismissed or underestimated because they didn't fit someone else's narrow definition of what a warrior should look like. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said one final time, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of authority that had commanded respect in most dangerous situations imaginable. "I'm going to give you one last chance to step back and rethink this course of action. I strongly advise you to take it." Rodriguez looked around at the crowd, feeding off their attention and misinterpreting their silence as approval for his behavior. In his mind, he had already won this confrontation simply by standing up to what he perceived as a weak Navy desk jockey trying to act tough. "I don't think so, sailor," he said with a smirk. "Maybe it's time someone showed you what real military bearing looks like." As he reached out to grab her shoulder in what was clearly intended as a physically intimidating gesture, Sarah knew that the time for words had passed. Rodriguez had made his choice, and now he would have to live with the consequences. What he didn't know, what his prejudice and arrogance had blinded him to, was that he was about to put his hands on one of the most highly trained and lethal warriors the military had ever produced. The moment his fingers made contact with her shoulder, Sarah's training took over. 25 years of muscle memory, of drills practiced until they became instinct, of combat experience that had been earned in the most dangerous places on Earth, all combined in a single fluid motion that would change the trajectory of this encounter forever. Rodriguez was about to discover that his assumptions about Navy personnel were not just wrong, but dangerously, catastrophically wrong. The crowd that had gathered to watch what they expected to be a verbal confrontation was about to witness something entirely different. They were about to see what happened when someone severely underestimated a warrior whose credentials were written not in ribbons and medals, but in scars and experience that most people could never comprehend. Rodriguez had picked the wrong person to intimidate, and he was about to learn that lesson in the most direct and immediate way possible. The moment Rodriguez's hand made contact with Sarah's shoulder, time seemed to slow down for everyone watching. What happened next would be discussed and analyzed for months to come, dissected in mess halls and barracks across the country. In the space of less than 3 seconds, Rodriguez went from confident aggressor to bewildered victim of his own poor judgment. Sarah's response was not born of anger or emotion, but of pure instinct honed by decades of the most demanding military training known to mankind. As his fingers pressed against her shoulder in what was clearly intended as an aggressive gesture, her body moved with the fluid precision of a master craftsman executing a technique practiced thousands of times. Her right hand came up in a swift, controlled motion, trapping his wrist against her shoulder while simultaneously stepping back and to the side. The movement looked almost dance-like to the untrained eye, graceful and economical. But those with combat experience recognized it immediately as a classic defensive technique designed to neutralize an attacker while controlling the level of force used. Rodriguez found himself suddenly off balance, his arm extended and trapped in a position that gave Sarah complete control over his movement and balance. "Staff Sergeant," she said calmly, her voice carrying none of the strain one might expect from someone engaged in a physical confrontation, "I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach." Her tone was professional, almost clinical, as if she were giving instruction in a classroom rather than controlling a man who outweighed her by at least 40 pounds. But Rodriguez, shocked by the sudden turn of events and embarrassed by his loss of control in front of the growing crowd, made the worst possible decision. Instead of recognizing that he had encountered someone with skills far beyond his own and backing down gracefully, he allowed his ego and prejudice to override his common sense. He attempted to pull free of her grip while simultaneously trying to grab her with his other hand. What followed was a textbook demonstration of why Navy SEALs are considered among the most elite warriors in the world. Sarah's movements flowed like water, each technique building seamlessly on the last. As Rodriguez tried to pull away, she used his own momentum against him, guiding him into an armbar that left him face down on the ground with his arm extended behind him at an angle that made any further resistance extremely inadvisable. The entire sequence took less than 5 seconds. One moment Rodriguez had been standing confidently, using his size and perceived authority to intimidate what he thought was a weak opponent. The next moment he was eating concrete, completely immobilized by someone he had dismissed as nothing more than Navy support staff. The crowd that had gathered to watch what they expected to be a one-sided confrontation found themselves witnessing something entirely different. A masterclass in combat technique delivered by someone they had all underestimated. "Are we done here, Staff Sergeant?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice carrying no trace of exertion despite having just controlled and neutralized a much larger opponent. "Because I'd really prefer not to have to write up a report about this incident." The threat was subtle but clear. She was offering him a way out that wouldn't result in formal charges or a permanent mark on his record. Rodriguez, his face pressed against the concrete, and his arm held in a position that made it clear he was completely at her mercy, finally began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The pain in his shoulder was sharp and immediate, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation of being so thoroughly dominated in front of his peers. "Yes," he gasped, his voice muffled by his position on the ground. "Yes, we're done." Sarah held the position for another moment, making sure he understood the lesson, then smoothly released him and stepped back. Her movements remained controlled and professional, showing no signs of the adrenaline that most people would be experiencing after such a confrontation. Rodriguez struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and his shoulder aching from the brief but effective demonstration of Sarah's capabilities. The crowd that had gathered stood in stunned silence. Many had pulled out their phones to record what they expected to be a verbal confrontation that might escalate to a shoving match. Instead, they had witnessed a level of skill and professionalism that most of them had never seen outside of training videos. Whispered conversations began to ripple through the group as people tried to process what they had just witnessed. "Who is she?" someone whispered. "Where did she learn to do that?" The question spread through the crowd like wildfire. Several of the more experienced service members were beginning to put pieces together, recognizing the quality and precision of the techniques they had just observed. Those kind of skills didn't come from standard military training or weekend martial art classes. They came from somewhere much more exclusive and demanding. Rodriguez, still trying to process his rapid transition from aggressor to victim, looked at Sarah with a mixture of confusion and dawning respect. For the first time since the confrontation began, he was seeing her not as a stereotype or a target for his prejudices, but as an individual whose capabilities he had severely misjudged. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying none of the bluster and aggression that had characterized his earlier comments. Sarah looked around at the crowd, then back at Rodriguez. She had hoped to avoid this moment, had tried repeatedly to de-escalate the situation before it reached this point. But sometimes the truth had to be revealed, sometimes assumptions had to be shattered in the most direct way possible. "Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez," she said simply, using her former rank. "Recently retired from Naval Special Warfare Command." The words hit the crowd like a physical force. Naval Special Warfare Command was the official designation for the SEAL teams, and anyone with military knowledge understood immediately what that meant. The woman they had all been watching, the person Rodriguez had dismissed as Navy support staff, was a Navy SEAL. Not just any SEAL, but one with enough seniority and experience to have reached the rank of Chief Petty Officer, a position that typically required at least 15 to 20 years of exemplary service. Rodriguez's face went through a rapid series of expressions as the full implications of Sarah's revelation sank in. He had attacked a Navy SEAL. He had put his hands on one of the most elite warriors the military produced, someone whose training and experience made his own 8 years of Marine service look like basic training. The realization was devastating to his ego and terrifying in its implications for his career. 25 years, Sarah continued, her voice still calm and professional despite the obvious impact her words were having on the crowd. 12 deployments across 3 different theaters of operation. Multiple classified missions that I obviously can't discuss. I retired 6 months ago and now work as a civilian consultant, sharing expertise with various military units. She paused, letting the information sink in, including Marine units that are interested in learning advanced close-quarters combat techniques. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Rodriguez had attacked someone who was literally qualified to train Marines in combat skills. The person he had dismissed as weak and unworthy was someone who had spent more than 2 decades in roles that most Marines could only dream of achieving. The cognitive dissonance was visible on his face as he struggled to reconcile his prejudices with the reality standing in front of him. Word of the confrontation began to spread beyond the immediate crowd. Service members who had witnessed the encounter were already sharing the story with their units, and within minutes, officers and senior non-commissioned officers from various branches were arriving to assess the situation. The last thing any of them wanted was an inter-service incident that could escalate into a formal investigation or disciplinary action. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, the Marine officer responsible for Rodriguez's unit, arrived first. A veteran of multiple combat deployments with over 20 years of experience, Patterson had the kind of situational awareness that came from years of dealing with Marines who had gotten themselves into trouble. He took one look at the crowd, the body language of the participants, and Rodriguez's disheveled appearance, and immediately understood that his Marine had stepped into something well beyond his capabilities. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Patterson said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of command and the promise of consequences. Would you mind explaining to me why there's a crowd gathered around you, and why you look like you've been wrestling on the concrete? His tone was deceptively mild, but everyone present recognized the danger lurking beneath the surface. Rodriguez straightened to attention, his military bearing returning despite his obvious discomfort. Sir, there was a misunderstanding between myself and this Navy personnel, he said, his voice carefully neutral. He was clearly hoping to minimize the incident and avoid the full consequences of his actions. Patterson's eyes shifted to Sarah, and his experienced gaze immediately picked up details that Rodriguez had missed. Her posture, the way she carried herself, the calm confidence that seemed to radiate from her even in the aftermath of physical confrontation, all spoke to someone with extensive combat experience. This was not the Navy support staff that Rodriguez had apparently assumed her to be. And you are? Patterson asked Sarah, his tone respectful but curious. He had learned long ago that assumptions about people in military settings were often dangerous and frequently wrong. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, retired, Sarah replied, using her former rank and title. Naval Special Warfare Command. I'm currently working as a civilian consultant here for briefings on advanced combat techniques. She paused, then added, there was indeed a misunderstanding, sir. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez made some assumptions about my background and role, and when the situation escalated to physical contact, I had to respond appropriately. The phrase "had to respond appropriately" was military speak for I defended myself when he attacked me, and Patterson understood immediately what had transpired. His Marine had picked a fight with a Navy SEAL and had been professionally and efficiently neutralized. The implications for Rodriguez's career, for inter-service relations, and for Patterson's own command responsibilities were significant and troubling. I see, Patterson said quietly, his mind already working through the various ways this incident could be handled. Chief Martinez, on behalf of the Marine Corps, I apologize for any unprofessional behavior you may have encountered. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you and I need to have a conversation immediately. His tone made it clear that the conversation would not be pleasant for Rodriguez. But Sarah, true to her professional character, was not interested in destroying Rodriguez's career or creating an inter-service incident. Sir, if I may, she said, addressing Patterson, I believe this was simply a case of miscommunication and poor assumptions. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was operating under incomplete information, and I'm confident that once he has all the facts, there won't be any further issues. Her words were carefully chosen, offering Rodriguez a path to redemption that didn't require formal disciplinary action or career-ending consequences. It was an act of professional courtesy that spoke to her character and experience, recognizing that destroying someone's career over a moment of poor judgment served no useful purpose. Patterson looked between Sarah and Rodriguez, understanding the dynamics at play. An experienced officer, he recognized both the gravity of what had occurred and the gracious way Sarah was handling the aftermath. "That's very generous of you, Chief Martinez," he said. "However, I think Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and I still need to discuss appropriate professional conduct and the importance of not making assumptions about fellow service members." Rodriguez, finally beginning to fully comprehend both what had happened and how Sarah was protecting him from the full consequences of his actions, found his voice. "Chief Martinez," he said, his tone completely different from the aggressive bluster he had displayed earlier, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about you that were completely wrong, and I behaved in a manner unbecoming of a Marine. I am sorry." The apology was clearly sincere, born of genuine remorse rather than mere expediency. Sarah nodded, accepting it with the same professionalism she had shown throughout the encounter. "Apology accepted, Staff Sergeant," she said. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them." As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate crisis passed, Rodriguez was left to contemplate the full magnitude of his error in judgment. He had not only attacked a superior warrior, but he had done so based on prejudices and assumptions that had nearly destroyed his career. The woman he had dismissed as weak Navy support staff had not only defended herself with skills he could barely comprehend, but had then shown him mercy and professionalism that probably saved his military career. The incident would become a learning moment, not just for Rodriguez, but for everyone who witnessed it or heard about it later. It served as a powerful reminder that in the modern military, strength and capability came in many forms, and that judging people based on appearances or preconceived notions was not just wrong, but potentially dangerous. Sarah Martinez had spent 25 years proving that warriors came in all shapes and sizes, and on this morning in San Diego, she had delivered that lesson one more time to someone who desperately needed to learn it. The days following the confrontation between Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and Chief Martinez brought a period of reflection and learning that would have lasting impacts far beyond the individuals directly involved. Word of the incident spread through the military community like wildfire, carried by the dozens of service members who had witnessed the encounter and the many more who had heard about it secondhand. The story evolved and changed with each telling, but the core message remained consistent. Assumptions about fellow service members could be not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. For Rodriguez, the immediate aftermath was a mixture of professional consequences and personal soul-searching that would fundamentally change his perspective on military service and leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson's promised conversation had indeed been thorough and uncomfortable, involving not just a detailed review of the incident, but a broader discussion about prejudice, professionalism, and the kind of leadership the Marine Corps expected from its non-commissioned officers. Staff Sergeant Patterson had said during their private meeting, "In 8 years of service, you've built a reputation as a competent Marine and a reliable leader. But what happened yesterday threatens to undermine everything you've accomplished. More importantly, it reveals some fundamental flaws in your thinking that need to be addressed immediately." Patterson's tone was serious, but not unsympathetic, recognizing that Rodriguez's behavior, while inexcusable, stemmed from attitudes that were unfortunately common in certain military circles. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Rodriguez's military career. Patterson methodically dissected every aspect of the incident, from the initial collision through the final confrontation, highlighting each point where Rodriguez could have made different choices. The colonel's analysis was clinical and precise, leaving no room for excuses or justification. You made assumptions based on gender, service branch, and physical appearance, Patterson explained. You allowed inter-service rivalry to override your professional judgment. You escalated a minor accident into a major confrontation. And finally, you initiated physical contact with someone you perceived as weaker than yourself. Every single one of these decisions was wrong, both professionally and morally. But Patterson also recognized that Rodriguez's behavior reflected broader cultural issues within the military that needed to be addressed systematically rather than through individual punishment alone. This isn't just about you, Staff Sergeant, he continued. This is about attitudes and assumptions that exist throughout our ranks. You're going to help me address those attitudes, starting with your own unit and extending to every Marine you have the opportunity to influence. The consequences for Rodriguez were significant, but focused on education and improvement rather than punishment. He was required to attend sensitivity training sessions focused on gender integration and inter-service cooperation. More importantly, he was assigned to work directly with Sarah Martinez over the following weeks, learning about SEAL training and operations while she conducted her consulting work with various military units. The irony was not lost on Rodriguez that his punishment involved being trained by the person he had attacked. But Sarah, true to her professional character, approached the assignment with the same dedication and thoroughness she brought to all her work. She saw it as an opportunity to bridge understanding between different military cultures and to challenge the kind of thinking that had led to their confrontation. Their first formal interaction after the incident took place in a conference room at the Joint Training Facility. Rodriguez entered the room with obvious discomfort, still struggling to reconcile his preconceptions with the reality of who Sarah Martinez was and what she represented. Sarah, meanwhile, approached the meeting with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout their confrontation. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said as he took a seat across from her, "I want you to understand that I don't hold grudges and I don't believe in punishment for its own sake. What happened between us was a learning opportunity both for you and for the broader military community. My goal over the next few weeks is to help you understand not just who I am, but what my experience represents about the changing face of military service." Over the course of their sessions together, Rodriguez learned about Sarah's journey from a young woman fighting for acceptance in a male-dominated field to a seasoned veteran whose expertise was sought by military units around the world. He heard stories of missions he could never have imagined, of challenges that tested not just physical strength, but mental toughness, adaptability, and leadership under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Sarah shared her experiences not to intimidate or humiliate Rodriguez, but to help him understand the full scope of what modern military service entailed. She talked about the evolution of warfare, the changing roles of different service branches, and the increasing importance of specialized skills that didn't always correlate with traditional measures of military prowess. "The military I joined 25 years ago was different from the one I retired from," she explained during one of their sessions. "And the military you'll retire from will be different again. The constants are professionalism, adaptability, and respect for the capabilities of your fellow service members, regardless of what branch they serve in or what they look like." Rodriguez found himself fascinated despite his initial reluctance. Sarah's stories revealed a world of military service that he had never considered, operations that required not just physical courage, but intellectual flexibility, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to work effectively with diverse teams under extreme pressure. It became clear to him that his narrow definition of what constituted a real warrior had blinded him to the full spectrum of military excellence. The transformation in Rodriguez's thinking was gradual but profound. As he learned more about Sarah's background and the broader context of modern military operations, he began to question not just his assumptions about her, but his entire worldview regarding military service and leadership. The confident prejudices that had led to their confrontation began to crumble under the weight of evidence and experience. Word of Rodriguez's education sessions spread throughout his unit, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the original incident. Other Marines began to ask questions about their own assumptions and prejudices. Discussions that had previously been dismissed as politically correct nonsense began to be taken seriously as practical matters of military effectiveness and unit cohesion. Marine Lance Corporal Jennifer Hayes, one of the few women in Rodriguez's unit, noticed the change immediately. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez started treating me differently after those sessions with Chief Martinez, she later told her friends. Not better or worse, just different. More professionally, like he was actually seeing me as a Marine rather than as some kind of diversity experiment. It made a huge difference in how the rest of the unit treated me, too. The broader military community also took notice of the incident and its aftermath. Sarah's handling of the confrontation became a case study in professional conduct under pressure, while Rodriguez's transformation became an example of how education and exposure could change deeply held prejudices. Training programs began incorporating elements of their story, using it to illustrate the importance of avoiding assumptions about fellow service members. Colonel Patricia Williams, the senior officer overseeing joint operations at the facility, saw the incident as a valuable teaching moment for the entire command. What happened between Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and Chief Martinez could have been a disaster for inter-service relations and unit cohesion, she observed. Instead, it became an opportunity to address attitudes and assumptions that needed to be challenged anyway. Both of them handled the aftermath with a professionalism that reflects the best of military values. As weeks passed, Rodriguez found himself becoming an advocate for the same kind of thinking he had previously rejected. His own unit began performing better in joint operations, partly because he was no longer dismissing the contributions of personnel from other services. His leadership style evolved to become more inclusive and thoughtful, recognizing that strength came in many forms and that effective teams require diverse skills and perspectives. Sarah, meanwhile, found that the incident had enhanced her effectiveness as a consultant. Military personnel who might have initially dismissed her credentials now approached her with genuine respect and curiosity. The story of her confrontation with Rodriguez served as a powerful introduction that immediately established her credibility and expertise. The incident also sparked broader conversations within the military about integration, respect, and the changing nature of warfare. Senior leaders began to recognize that incidents like this one were symptoms of larger cultural issues that needed to be addressed systematically. Training programs were updated, policies were revised, and emphasis was placed on creating environments where all service members could contribute effectively regardless of their background or appearance. 6 months after their initial confrontation, Rodriguez and Sarah found themselves working together on a joint training exercise that brought together Marines, Navy SEALs, and personnel from other services. Rodriguez, now serving as a liaison officer, introduced Sarah to his unit with obvious pride and respect. "Marines," he said as Sarah prepared to brief them on advanced combat techniques, I want you to meet Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, retired from Naval Special Warfare Command. Chief Martinez has 25 years of experience in operations that most of us can only imagine, and she's here to share some of that expertise with us. I strongly encourage you to pay attention and ask questions because you're about to learn from one of the best warriors our military has ever produced. The introduction was a far cry from the dismissive attitude Rodriguez had displayed during their first encounter. It reflected not just his personal growth, but a broader understanding of what it meant to serve with honor and professionalism in a diverse military environment. As Sarah began her briefing, she looked out at the audience of Marines, sailors, and personnel from other services, all focused and ready to learn. The room contained people of different backgrounds, genders, and experiences, but they were united by their commitment to military service and their willingness to learn from each other. It was, she reflected, what the military at its best could be, a place where merit mattered more than appearance, where capability trumped assumptions, and where everyone had the opportunity to prove themselves through service rather than stereotypes. The transformation of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from prejudiced aggressor to respectful colleague and advocate illustrated the potential for growth and change that existed within the military community. His journey from ignorance to understanding, while painful and embarrassing, ultimately made him a better Marine and a better leader. More importantly, it demonstrated that even deeply held prejudices could be overcome through education, exposure, and the willingness to admit when you were wrong. The story of their confrontation and its aftermath became legendary within their military community, not because of the drama of the initial incident, but because of the professional way both individuals handled the situation and learned from it. It served as a reminder that the military's greatest strength lay not in any single warrior or unit, but in its ability to bring together diverse talents and perspectives in service of a common mission. Sarah Martinez and Michael Rodriguez had both served their country well, not just through their individual contributions, but through their willingness to bridge differences and build understanding across the arbitrary lines that sometimes divided military personnel from one another.